You are a ghost in your own home. So stop acting like you have a seat at the table. Those were the words my mother, Evelyn, chose to announce to the 64 guests attending my brother's engagement party. She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the Waterford crystal glass in her hand, swirling the amber liquid as if I were nothing more than a smudge on the rim. There was no gasping. A few people near the back of the room pretended not to have heard. The rest shifted in their seats and found something fascinating to study about the ceiling or their shoes. That was the gift my family had given to everyone around them. A finely tuned talent for selective deafness. My name is Elena Sterling. I am 32 years old. This is the story of how I reclaimed the inheritance they stole, and the home they tried to erase me from. But it is also the story of the years before that, the decade of small erasures, each one so quiet that I barely noticed until the sum of them added up to nothing. By the time I walked out of the courtroom 3 months after that engagement party, the woman who had once silenced me in front of 64 people could not even meet the gaze of the bailiff. Our house stood on the edge of a ravine in a town where reputation was the only currency that mattered. Millhaven was not a wealthy town, not precisely, but it was a town that wanted desperately to believe it was. The houses on Aldecrest Drive, ours among them, were large enough to suggest prosperity without quite achieving it. Ours was a colonial-style structure with white siding that always seemed to be peeling just enough to suggest we were barely keeping up appearances, a detail I found fitting in retrospect. My father, Richard Sterling, was the architect of our domestic hierarchy. He was a man who measured affection in percentages. My younger brother, Julian, sat at the top of the ledger, the golden heir, the one who could do no wrong, who would eventually inherit the firm and the trust and the brass nameplate on the office door. Then there was my mother, Evelyn, the gatekeeper of the family image, who treated the household like a theater production where I was cast permanently as the stagehand. I existed to clear the plates, to keep the books, and to be invisible. I was good at all three. There were 4 of us in that house, and only 3 of us were real. The air inside those walls always smelled faintly of lemon polish and suppressed resentment. Every room had a distinct texture of exclusion. The den was mahogany paneled and forbidden to me after 8 in the evening. That was where Richard and Julian watched football and discussed the future of Sterling architecture as though it were a birthright that could only pass through the male line. The living room was for guests, which meant it was for the performance of the family rather than the family itself. The kitchen was my primary domain, a tiled expanse where I learned to be efficient, silent, and observant. I remember the weight of the silver platters I carried for years, the way the metal would bite into my palms during Christmas dinners and summer parties, and the quarterly gatherings my parents held to maintain the appearance of social standing. I remember learning to carry them with my elbows tucked close to my sides so I didn't brush against anything or anyone, to move through a room without being noticed, to be useful without being present. I was the one who balanced the family checkbook, reconciling accounts that never seemed to align with the reality of our expenses. My father gave me the task when I was 14, after his bookkeeper retired. "You have a talent for numbers," he told me, which was the closest thing to a compliment he ever offered. I took it and held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile you're not sure belongs to you. I knew exactly how much was in the savings accounts, $412,000, earmarked for my education and eventual independence, set aside by my grandfather Harold in a trust that Richard managed. I knew this because I was the one who watched the numbers, who cross-referenced the quarterly statements, who noticed when the figures began to shift in ways that didn't match the deposits. I should have said something then. I didn't. I told myself it was a rounding error, a timing issue, a clerical discrepancy that would resolve itself. I had been trained, after all, not to make scenes. The mathematics of neglect. The slights were not always loud. They were systemic, and they accumulated the way debt does, invisibly until they couldn't be ignored. When I graduated at the top of my class from Millhaven High, Richard didn't attend the ceremony. He was busy, Evelyn explained, helping Julian choose a new vehicle. Julian had wrecked his second car in a parking lot outside a bar on Route 9, and the situation required immediate attention. I sat in the audience that afternoon watching the empty seat beside my mother, who had arrived late and forgotten to RSVP to my commencement dinner, so we were seated at the end of a table near the kitchen. "You're practical, Elena," she told me later that night while I folded laundry, her voice carrying the mild, faintly apologetic tone she used when she knew she'd done something wrong but couldn't bring herself to name it. You don't need a celebration to know you're smart. Julian needs the boost. That was the first time I felt the cold, hard realization that my value is defined entirely by my utility to their success. I was smart, yes, but smart in the way a good appliance is smart. Reliable. Low maintenance. Easily overlooked until something breaks. When I was accepted to Whitmore College on a partial scholarship, Evelyn cried. Not from pride, she told me, but from relief. At least that's settled, she said. Then she asked if I could finish the laundry before bed. I studied accounting. I worked 3 jobs during my undergraduate years: library aide, data entry clerk for a local insurance firm, weekend cashier at the hardware store 2 towns over. I was not miserable exactly. I was efficient. I learned to be grateful for small things, the particular quiet of the library at 6 in the morning, a good cup of coffee, numbers that balanced precisely on the first try. I built a life out of margins. I didn't know yet that the people I'd left behind were systematically dismantling the foundation beneath it. During my second year at Whitmore, my grandfather Harold died quietly in his sleep in the house on Aldercrest Drive. He was 81. He had been a civil engineer, a man of careful measurements and long silences, and he had, in his quiet way, seen me. He left me the house in his will, not the family's shared property, but specifically and explicitly to me, Elena Marie Sterling, with a handwritten note attached to the notarized copy that said, "Because you are the one who will take care of it." I didn't cry when I read it. I pressed the paper flat and put it in a folder with the rest of the estate documents. I was 28 when the estate was settled. I was living in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner in Mill Haven, working as a staff accountant at a mid-size firm, and coming back to the house on weekends to manage the household books, a habit I'd never quite broken. Richard told me he would handle the deed transfer. "It's too much for you to manage, dear," he said, tapping the documents against his palm the way he always did when he was performing patience. "I'll handle the taxes and the filing. You just keep doing what you do best." He smiled when he said it. That was the thing about Richard. His cruelty was always perfectly upholstered. I handed him the documents. I went back to my apartment. I didn't think about it again for 3 months. The escalation began in the spring of 2024, though I didn't understand it as an escalation at first. It announced itself as a single piece of mail. I walked into my father's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November to drop off the monthly reconciliation. A task I still performed out of inertia and, if I'm honest, out of a stubborn belief that being useful was a form of belonging. The office was empty. Richard was at a client meeting. I set the folder on his desk, and that's when I saw it. A collection notice from the bank, resting face up in the center of the blotter as though it had been waiting for me specifically. It was addressed to me but marked urgent. Foreclosure warning. My heart didn't race. It turned to ice. I looked at the letterhead. First Aldercrest Savings and Loan, the same institution where my grandfather's account had been held, where my inheritance trust had been deposited. I set down my bag. I picked up the letter. I read it twice slowly, the way you read something when you're hoping the meaning will change on the second pass. The account was empty. There was $14.22 left in the balance. A property with a deed in my name, or rather, a property with a deed bearing what appeared to be my name, had been used as collateral for a $750,000 business loan, and the loan was in default. I set the letter down. I stood in the center of the room. The smell of pipe tobacco and stale paper filled the silence around me. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Richard walked in, saw me, saw the letter in my hand. His face didn't change. He didn't flinch or flush or look away. He simply said, "Don't be dramatic. It's a temporary setback. If you make a scene, you're out of this house by midnight." I didn't scream. I didn't throw the papers. I didn't cry, which surprised me because I had cried at smaller things. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a father. I saw a thief. I saw a man who had calculated with precision exactly how much I could be taken from before I noticed, and who had miscalculated only the part where I noticed. I set the letter down on the desk. I turned around. I walked out of the room, up the stairs, and packed one suitcase, closed my laptop, my grandfather's handwritten note, and the folder of estate documents I had never quite brought myself to put away. I left my key on the kitchen counter. I walked out into the cold November rain and I did not look back. Not once. I drove 3 hours south on the interstate and stopped at a motel outside a town called Grayfield that I had never heard of, and will probably never visit again. The room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and old cigarettes. The heater rattled against the baseboard like something trying to escape. I sat on the edge of the bed and poured a cup of lukewarm tea from the complimentary kettle, and I thought, with great clarity, about what I knew. I knew the dates. I had always known the dates, every deposit, every withdrawal, every transfer going back 7 years because I had been the one doing the reconciling. I had the account numbers memorized. I knew the name of the notary on the original estate documents. I knew my own signature the way you know the sound of your own voice. I opened my laptop and began downloading my banking history. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Julian. I thought about calling a friend, but I didn't have many. Another cost of growing up as the household's invisible infrastructure. Instead, at 11:15 that night, I called Mr. Henderson, the estate attorney who had handled my grandfather's original will. He was 72 years old and kept late hours because his wife had died the year before, and the silence of his house bothered him. He answered on the second ring. I didn't cry. I spoke clearly. I told him I had evidence of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. I told him the amounts and the dates. I told him I wanted the deed restored to my name and the money returned. He listened for 12 minutes without interrupting. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave above the kitchenette counter. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elena, if what you're telling me is accurate, we will dismantle them." "It's accurate," I said. "I know," he said. "I drafted your grandfather's will." I knew Harold. He was very specific about his intentions. We spoke for another 40 minutes. When I hung up, I lay back on the motel bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling, which was shaped very loosely like a hand. I thought about my grandfather, the civil engineer, the man of careful measurements. I thought about what he had written on that note. "Because you are the one who will take care of it." I thought he had meant the house. Now I wondered if he'd meant something more. I fell asleep with my laptop open and my notes spread across the bedspread and the heater still rattling against the baseboard. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. The next 6 months were a surgical strike. I rented a small apartment in Grayfield, 2 rooms above a hardware store, quieter than anywhere I had lived before. And I became a student of the law. Not the broad sweep of it, but the specific, granular, procedural mechanics of estate fraud, deed forgery, and fiduciary breach. Mr. Henderson guided me, but he was careful to explain that the strength of the case would depend on evidence, and that the evidence would need to be mine. So it was mine. I spent days in the county clerk's office scanning public records. I found the forged deed. It had been filed 11 months after my grandfather's death, bearing my signature and the seal of a notary named Gerald Pham. Gerald Pham had retired from practice in April of 2022. The deed was dated September of 2022. I found this in a public database in 40 minutes. I noted the discrepancy in a spreadsheet and moved on. I hired a forensic document examiner named Dr. Constance Way, who charged me $4,500, every cent of which I had saved from years of working extra shifts at the library and later from freelance bookkeeping work I'd quietly built up on the side. Dr. Way analyzed the signature on the deed against a dozen verified samples of my genuine signature and produced a 43-page report concluding, with a high degree of confidence, that the deed's signature was a traced forgery. I found the loan applications. I found the business formation documents for Julian's restaurant, Maison Julien, which had opened in the spring of 2023 and closed, without ceremony, 8 months later. I found the invoices, the payroll records, the lease agreement, all of it pointing to the $750,000 that had been borrowed against a property that was not Richard's to borrow against. I built a file. It was thick and precise and cross-referenced and color-coded because that is how I think, and it was, I realize now, the most thorough piece of work I have ever done in my life. I worked 12-hour days. I ate poorly. I slept adequately. I did not grieve, not yet. Not for the family I was systematically proving had never existed in the way I'd wanted to believe. There would be time for that. For now there were numbers to follow, and numbers, unlike people, do not lie. On the morning I submitted the complete file to Mr. Henderson. He called me within an hour. "Elena," he said, "this is extraordinary. He did not say it as a compliment. He said it with the careful gravity of someone who understood exactly what it meant that a daughter had been required to build this case against her own father. Yes, I said. It is. I should go back to the beginning, to that evening in October, 6 weeks before I found the foreclosure notice, which means 6 weeks before I understood what was happening. Though the machinery had been running for years, Julian's engagement party was held on a Saturday night in the house on Aldercrest Drive. His fiancée was a woman named Brooke Callahan, who worked in marketing and had the particular gift of seeming interested in everything without being interested in anything. She was kind to me in the vague, performative way of someone who has been coached to manage difficult family situations. I liked her in spite of myself. I had not been asked to help plan the party. I had not been told the date until 4 days before. I came because not coming would have been noticed and remarked upon, and because some part of me, the stubborn, persistent part that refused to stop hoping, believed that perhaps this time would be different, that in front of 64 guests in my grandfather's house, I would be included. I wore a blue dress. I stood near the fireplace with a glass of sparkling water and listened to Richard tell the story of Julian's first business venture, a lemonade stand at age 7, which Richard had bankrolled and supervised and which Julian had mostly ignored, as though it were prophecy. Brooke laughed at the right moments. Julian looked pleased in the way of someone who has been told all his life that pleasing is his natural state. I don't know what prompted Evelyn to say it. Perhaps nothing prompted it. Perhaps she had simply been waiting for an audience large enough to make it count. She was standing near the drinks table, and I was moving past her toward the kitchen, because there were things that needed to be cleared. There were always things that needed to be cleared. And she turned, and without raising her voice, without even looking at me, she said, "You are a ghost in your own home, so stop acting like you have a seat at the table." The room did not go silent. That was the worst part. The room simply continued, and I stood there for a moment in the middle of it, holding someone else's empty glass, and then I kept walking. I went to the kitchen. I set the glass in the sink. I turned on the tap and let cold water run over my wrists the way I used to do when I was a child and the world felt like too much. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I said goodbye to Brooke, who squeezed my hand and looked briefly genuinely sorry, and who I have not spoken to since. I drove home. I did not cry. 6 weeks later, I found the letter on my father's desk. I understand now that the two things were not unrelated. Evelyn had always known, the way people know things they are not supposed to know, that something was wrong, that they had taken something they shouldn't have. The cruelty that night was not random. It was preemptive. She was trying to make me small enough that I wouldn't notice what was missing. It didn't work. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in February. It was cold, the particular cold of a winter that has stopped trying to be interesting and simply commits to the gray. I drove myself. I wore the same blue dress I had worn to the engagement party, because I am not above a private gesture of symmetry. The courtroom was small, paneled in light oak, and smelled of floor wax and old paper. My parents arrived separately from me, which was how I knew they had been advised not to seem united. They sat at the defense table looking, I thought, diminished, smaller than I remembered them, as though the house and the leather furniture and the Waterford crystal had been the source of their size all along. Richard wore a tie I recognized, dark blue with a small pattern of anchors. Evelyn had had her hair done. She looked, despite everything, like a woman attending a luncheon. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Voss, who had sharp eyes behind narrow glasses and an expression of permanent, courteous skepticism. She did not waste time. She opened the file. She turned to the page with the forged signature. She examined it, then examined the verified sample beside it. She looked at Dr. Way's report, the 43 pages of analysis, the overlay comparisons, the pressure pattern differentials. She read quietly for several minutes while the room stayed very still. Then she said, "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the notary listed on this deed, Gerald Pham, surrendered his license in April of 2022. This document is dated September of 2022. Do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Richard's attorney, a man named Hartwell who had driven up from the city, and who radiated the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room he chooses to enter, began to speak. The judge silenced him with a look. She was speaking to Richard. Richard tried. He stood, and the flush started at his collar and moved upward. The mottled red I had watched appear every time something did not go according to his plan. He said something about a clerical error. He said something about the complexity of estate paperwork. He said the name of a colleague who had apparently assisted with the filing. He said, with a desperation that was new to his voice, that there had been a miscommunication. The judge cut him off. Not unkindly, but with the finality of someone closing a book. She read aloud the transfer dates, the dollar amounts, the specific statutory codes the evidence indicated had been violated. She ordered an immediate freeze on their assets and appointed a financial examiner to assess the scope of the estate's mismanagement. She said the word fraud twice in complete sentences, looking directly at my father. Richard sat down. His shoulders dropped in a way I had never seen before, not slumped with defeat, exactly, but collapsed, as though the scaffolding had been removed from somewhere essential. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the floor. She did not look at me once during the entire proceeding, not when I gave my statement, not when the judge read my name into the record as the rightful property owner, not when I gathered my files at the table's end. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I said, "The truth has no room for your stories." Then I walked past them and out through the double doors into the cold February air, and I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment with my face turned up toward a sky the color of old pewter, and I breathed. The aftermath was not dramatic. That surprised me. I had braced for scenes, for phone calls in the night, for ambushes at the grocery store, for the particular violence of people who believe their humiliation is your fault. But my parents, stripped of the house and forced to sell their remaining assets to repay the $412,000, became very quiet. Julian moved to Portland. He did not call. I heard through Brooke, who reached out once briefly, to say she was sorry for everything and that she hoped I was well, that he was working in a restaurant supply business owned by a friend of a friend, that he was doing okay. I wished him genuinely an adequate life, not a good one, just an adequate one. The letters from my parents arrived in 3 waves. The first wave came in March, 2 weeks after the hearing. These were practical letters, formal requests routed through their attorney about the timeline for the property transfer, questions about certain items left in the house, one bewildering inquiry about a set of chairs that had belonged to Richard's mother. I responded through Mr. Henderson, cleanly, precisely, without editorializing. The second wave came in April. These were the apology letters that weren't quite apologies, long, dense, looping missives about family loyalty and the pressure Richard had been under, about misunderstandings, about how they had only ever wanted what was best for all of us. Evelyn's letter mentioned in its 14th paragraph that she had always admired my resilience. She did not use the word sorry. She used the phrase regrettable outcomes. She signed it with "Love, Mother," and the word love looked strange on the page, surrounded by all that careful evasion, like a window someone had broken and tried to tape back together. Richard's letter was shorter. It was about Julian. He said that Julian had struggled his whole life in ways people didn't understand, that it was a father's job to protect his children, that sometimes difficult decisions were made out of necessity. He did not mention my name directly in the letter. I was present only in the spaces between sentences. I read both letters once, folded them, and put them in the file. Not because they mattered. Because someday they might, and I have learned to keep things that matter. The third wave never came. By May the letters had stopped. My parents had moved to a smaller house 3 towns over. I know this only because the property records are public, and I have not heard from them since. It did not matter. Their silence was as loud as their demands had once been. I moved back into the house on Aldercrest Drive in March, 2 weeks after the court order was finalized. The first thing I did was open all the windows, even though it was cold. I let the February air move through every room, the kitchen, the living room, the mahogany paneled den that had been forbidden to me after 8 in the evenings. I stood in the center of the den and looked at the bookshelves and the armchairs and the desk by the window and thought, I am allowed to be here. I said it aloud to no one, to the empty room, to the cold air moving through. I am allowed to be here. Then I opened a window in the den too, and let the outside in. The second thing I did was rip out the garden. There had been a formal garden behind the house, regimented, symmetrical, Evelyn's project, maintained by a man named Dennis who came every 2 weeks and never spoke, boxwoods trimmed into tight geometric shapes, a gravel path, roses that bloomed in careful colors and were never picked. I had not been allowed to walk in it as a child. Too much to damage, my mother had said. I spent a long weekend removing the boxwoods myself, digging them out at the root, sweating through 2 pairs of work gloves. I was not graceful about it. I was thorough. By Sunday evening, I had a clean expanse of turned earth behind the house, and a pile of uprooted hedges at the edge of the ravine, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has destroyed something with her own hands and found it clarifying. In April, I planted a kitchen garden. Tomatoes, herbs, beans, things my grandfather had grown in a smaller version when he was alive. I planted them in rows that were slightly uneven, because I wanted them to be mine and not a performance of someone else's idea of order. They grew imperfectly, the way things do when they are given enough room. The air in the house changed, or perhaps I did. It no longer smelled of lemon polish and suppressed resentment. It smelled in the summer of whatever was growing outside the kitchen window, basil and warm soil, and sometimes, on good evenings, the faint green smell of rain moving up from the ravine. I am 32 years old. I live in the house that they tried to take from me. I work as a senior forensic accountant now, a career pivot that my former employer supported with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, perhaps because the skills are not so different from what I had always been doing. Only now the discrepancies I find belong to other people's fathers. I am not unscathed. I want to be clear about that. I don't believe in the narrative of survival that ends cleanly, where the courtroom victory reorganizes all the preceding pain into something meaningful and resolved. Some mornings I wake up and the first thing I feel is the weight of what I lost. Not the money, not the house, but the family I had spent 32 years trying to earn my place in. A family that had, it turned out, decided my place before I was old enough to understand the decision had been made. I grieve for the father who came to my graduation. He didn't exist, but I grieve for him anyway. I grieve for the mother who might have seen me. I grieve for a version of Julian who might have been, in different circumstances, a brother. I am also not permanently broken, which is the other thing I want to be clear about. These are not contradictory. Mr. Henderson came to see the house last July. He stood in the kitchen garden and looked at the tomatoes, which were by then unprofessional looking but prolific, and he said, "Harold would have liked this." I didn't answer because I didn't trust my voice, but I nodded and handed him a tomato still warm from the sun, and he ate it standing there in the garden with his jacket on, juice running down his chin, and neither of us said anything for a while. That was enough. That was its own kind of sufficient. I know what a signature is worth now, not just legally, not just as an instrument of property and debt, but as a statement of self. I know what it costs to let someone else speak for you, to let someone else hold the pen. I know the weight of a dollar earned by my own hand. And I know the difference between loyalty demanded by blood and loyalty built by choice. I am no longer a ghost in my own home. I am the owner, the witness, the one who keeps the records and balances the accounts and knows, down to the last digit, what she is owed. I am the one who writes the ending, and I am not finished yet.